Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee meeting, the best subcommittee of the House. All right, General Assembly. We are going to move through some decisions today, and we will start with our analyst.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We are just going to move through the white packet page by page and then reference the pink packet as appropriate for each agency, and then we'll have the analysts come up and rotate, if that's okay with you. So we will begin on page 2 for the Public Service Commission. The Senate adopted narrative requesting a report on enforcement actions and prohibited marketing practices. The second item is also Senate narrative on utility termination restrictions during winter heating season in cases of extreme temperature. There is a modification of this item for your consideration on page 2 of the pink packet. What this modification does is add into the narrative consideration of adjusting these parameters based on extreme temperatures from climate change. And also for the Public Service Commission, there is a new item on page 1 of the pink packet for your consideration, and this is regarding impacts of the changes of RPS standard on compliance costs and utility rate ratepayers.
Thank you.
On page 4 of your white packet for the Office of People's Counsel, the DLS recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Second. Thank you.
Page 5 is the Chesapeake Bay overview. The agency is non-budgeted. The agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Thank you.
Page 6 in your white packet moves on to the Maryland Energy Administration. The first DLS recommendation was annual language on the CEF revenue spending and fund balance.
Thank you.
The second item on page 7 was also a DLS recommendation for narrative on federal stimulus funding and use for grants.
Thank you.
The third item on page 8 for MEA is narrative on CEF revenues transferred to the dedicated purpose account. And there is a modification on page 3 of your pink packet. This modification makes a slight adjustment just to include details of expenditures to date on this funding.
Thank you.
And there is an additional page for MEA on page 4 of your pink packet. This is narrative regarding alternative compliance payment revenues.
Thank you.
Looking on page 9 at the Maryland Automobile Insurance Fund, the first action is committee narrative requesting quarterly financial statements for both the insured and uninsured divisions. The agency concurred in part, requesting the shifting of due dates to the following to accommodate the quarterly and full year closeout process: July 31st, 2024, October 31st, 2024, March 15th, 2025, and May 15th, 2025. The Senate adopted a modified version to accommodate the extended due dates.
Thank you.
And looking at the Maryland Insurance Administration on page 11, the first action is committee narrative requesting reports on the status of the Insurance Tracking System, or ITS, development project. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Then we have 2 additional pages for the Maryland Insurance Administration on page 5 and page 7 of the pink packet. On page...
Go ahead.
On page 5, the first one is committee narrative requesting a joint report from MIA and the Maryland Automobile Insurance Fund on methods for determining auto insurance rate affordability.
Thank you.
The second action on page 7 is committee narrative requesting a report from MIA on rate, file, and use activity by the Maryland Automobile Insurance Fund.
Thank you.
Page 12, back in your white packet, is Canal Place Preservation and Development Authority. The DLS recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Pages 13 to 18 are actions pertaining to Department of Information Technology. The first action on page 13 is language restricting general funds pending the submission of fiscal 2025 Information Technology project request for DGS, the Department of General Services Major IT project. Agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Thank you.
Second item on page 14 is also a language restricting general funds until the fiscal 2025 Information Technology project request is provided to DLS for the Department of Health. The agency concurred, Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
The third item on page 15 is it reduces general fund to increase turnover expectancy to 25%. The agency disagreed, but the Senate adopted DLS's recommendation.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
Item 4 is a narrative requesting report on managing for result indicator for value and costs of DOIT's services to state agencies. Agency concurred, Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
Item 5 is a narrative requesting report on spending of the cybersecurity related funds in the dedicated purpose account. Agency concurred, Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
There are 2 additional first house actions on page 17 and 18. The first item is a language restricting general fund in the security program until a report on the implementation of the cybersecurity assessment remediation is provided. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
The second item is language restricting general fund until a report on the timeline for completing cybersecurity related actions is provided. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
Turning now to page 19, you begin the Department of Transportation. Recommendation 1 on page 19 is annual budget bill language requiring notification of changes to the capital program. The agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
On page 21, in the Secretary's office, the recommendation for the operating is to adopt annual budget bill language restricting operating grants to the amount budgeted. The agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
In your pink packet on page 8 is some additional narrative for your consideration. This would request a report on the changes to the other capital projects required to meet the additional costs for the Purple Line light rail project.
Move to concur on the additional committee narrative.
Thank you.
Turning now to page in the white packet, page 22, Secretary's Office PAYGO. The recommendation is annual budget bill language requiring notification of changes to the capital program or grants. The agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
On page 23 is the WMATA operating grant. The recommendation was to concur with the governor's budget. The agency agreed and the Senate adopted. However, on page 9, there is narrative for your consideration. This narrative would request a report from WMATA on actions it's taking to fight fare evasion.
Move to concur on the additional committee narrative.
Thank you.
On page 24 is the WMATA capital grant. The recommendation was to concur with the governor's budget. The agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
On page 25 is the MDOT debt service requirements. There are 2 recommendations. On page 25 is recommendation, annual narrative, language, which sets debt limits for both consolidated transportation bonds and non-traditional debt.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
And then on page 26, the second item is annual language requesting reports on non-traditional debt. This agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
Turning now to page 28, State Highway Administration operating, the recommendation was to concur with the budget. The agency concurred, the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
You now have in your pink packet.
Thank you. Go ahead.
There are two additional pieces of narrative for consideration on the PAYGO program. The first one is a report requested for bike lane information on the old Georgetown Road or Maryland 187 bike lanes.
Move to concur in the additional committee narrative.
And on page 11,
Thank you.
I'm sorry, excuse me. On page 11 is an additional piece of narrative requesting a report on safety between the Torrey C. Brown Trail and Moncton Road crosswalk.
Move to concur on the additional committee narrative.
Wait. Thank you.
And turning now to page 29 in your white packet, the Maryland Port Administration operating budget. The recommendation was concur. The Senate adopted.
Thank you.
And on page 30 was the PAYGO program. The recommendation was concur. However, the Senate on page 31 had some narrative they adopted. This is on the Howard Street Tunnel project and simply indicates intent that this is an important project that all levels of government should move forward with. This is Senate narrative.
Second.
Thank you.
And on page 12 of your color packet is an additional piece of narrative relating to Howard Street Tunnel, requesting quarterly reports on the progress of that important project.
Move to concur on the additional committee narrative.
Thank you.
Page 32 in your white packet moves on to MDOT Motor Vehicle Administration. The DLS recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance, and the agency concurred. However, the Senate adopted some narrative, which you can see on page 33 in that white packet. The first item is a report on Maryland motorists with improper out-of-state tags.
Move to concur on the additional narrative.
Thank you.
The second item that the Senate adopted is narrative on the Maryland Automobile Insurance Fund uninsured division solvency.
Move to reject the additional committee narrative.
Thank you.
And there is a new item for your consideration for MVA on page 13 of your pink packet. This is language restricting funds pending a report on a feasibility study for changing the structure and funding of the Ignition Interlock program.
Move to concur on the additional language.
Thank you.
Okay. Page 35, back in your white packet, is Maryland MDOT MVA on the PAYGO capital side. DLS recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
Page 36 in your white packet begins the Maryland Transit Administration. The DLS recommendation was to restrict funds pending a report, or excuse me, several reports of progress on the Purple Line light rail. However, the Senate modified this to the item that you see on page 37, which is instead narrative, asking for the same information but not withholding funds. So the Senate adopted this narrative on page 37.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
At the bottom of page 37 is the second item from the Senate, which restricts funding both from MTA and from MDOT, the Secretary's office, pending a report on annual service changes that had impacts on bus routes in Baltimore City.
Move to reject.
One second,
Okay.
please. Just 1 second, please. Can you just withdraw that motion that you just made to?
Withdraw the motion.
Okay, so on this, wait a minute, what page are we on?
Bottom of page 37 is where it
Right,
starts.
okay. So number 2 on page 37
Yes.
is the bus link, City Link, Brown, and Local Link 33 routes, and we are going to concur with that decision. So may I have a motion?
Move to concur.
Okay, thank you. So that is the last item for MTA. Operating on page 40 is the Maryland Transit Administration PAYGO Capital. DLS recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Page 41 is the Aviation Administration. DLS recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
Page 42 is the Aviation Administration capital side. The DLS recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Second.
Thank you.
Page 43 is the beginning of the Maryland Transportation Authority. That is a non-budgeted agency, and the agency concurred and the Senate adopted. However, there is some new items for your consideration. Begins on page 15 in your pink packet. The first item is committee narrative regarding buffered bicycle and pedestrian lanes at MDTA facilities.
Move to concur on the additional committee narrative.
Thank you.
The second item is on page 16 of your pink packet, and this is committee narrative regarding collecting outstanding tolls from motorists that are from out of state but go through MDTA facilities.
Move to concur on the additional committee narrative.
Okay. And on page 44 in your white packet is the Maryland Transportation Authority PAYGO Capital. DLS recommendation was that the agency is again non-budgeted. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
Page 45 is the Department of Natural Resources. The first recommendation there is for outdoor recreation reporting. The agency concurred in part and the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
On page 46, second recommendation there is for Chesapeake Bay Restoration Spending Report. The agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
Recommendation number 3 is also for Chesapeake Bay Restoration Spending. They concurred in part. The first house adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
Moving to page 48, recommendation number 4 at the bottom of the page there is for Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bay 29 Trust Fund annual work and expenditure plans. The agency concurred, the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
Moving now to page 50, the additional first house actions. Recommendation number 1, or first action there was the Cultural and Historical Resources Preservation Plan. The Senate adopted that narrative.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
The additional narrative is also for the Merkle Wildlife Sanctuary.
Move to reject.
Thank you.
On page 51, recommendation number 3 is for a mentored hunt program narrative.
Move to reject.
Thank you.
On page 52, recommendation, or the addition of 4 is for the recreational striped bass. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
So on the additional page packet, page 17 is for a fee, fine, and penalty structure report.
Move to concur in the Senate rejection. Right? No?
This is on page 17
Apologies.
of
Move to
the
concur in
additional
the committee
pages.
narrative.
That was a move to concur on the committee narrative, page 17, and that was seconded. Thank you.
Page 18 in your additional pages is for language restricting $50,000 until a Natural Resources Police Diversification and Progress Report is submitted.
Second.
Thank you.
On page 19 is narrative on a State Lakes Protection and Restoration Fund report.
Move to concur in the committee narrative.
Thank you.
Back in your decision document on page 53 is the Department of Agriculture. The first recommendation there is a turnover cut. The agency disagreed, noting that there are positions that are actually filled there and that the cut would be for less. The Senate rejected this.
Move to concur in the Senate rejection.
Thank you.
Recommendation number 2 is for a reduction to the weights and measures program due to the consideration that it looked like there was additional special funds. The agency disagreed, noting that special funds were coming from balance. The Senate rejected that.
Move to concur with the Senate rejection.
Thank you.
Bottom of page 53, the status and future of value-added agriculture in Maryland report. The agency concurred in part, noting that they'd like to take a piece out of that narrative related to the Salisbury University's Business, Economic, and Community Outreach Network. Therefore, it was modified as shown on the bottom of page 54 going on to page 55. The Senate adopted that revised version.
Move to concur in the
Revised.
revised version.
Thank you.
On the bottom of page 55 is a reduction for the nuisance insects black fly midge treatment program. The agency disagreed, and the first house rejected.
Move to concur in the rejection.
Thank you.
On page 56 are the additional first house actions. The first one there is for mentored hunt program report.
Move to reject.
Thank you.
On page 57, number 2 is for a blue catfish marketing report.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
On color for the additional page packet, page 20, there's an electric vehicle charging station inspection program report.
Move to concur on the additional committee narrative.
Thank you.
Now, moving to page 58 of your main decision document. This is the Maryland Department of the Environment. The first recommendation there is to restrict $200,000 until the submission of its scrap tire annual report. The agency disagreed. The Senate rejected this in order to do narrative, which we'll get to in a second.
Concur with the Senate rejection.
Thank you.
Recommendation number 2 on the bottom of page 58 is to restrict $200,000 until the submission of correct budget expenditures in the personnel category. The agency disagreed. The first house adopted.
Move to concur with the Senate option.
Thank
Page
you.
59, recommendation number 3 is for an enforcement inspection position strength assessment report. The agency disagreed. First house adopted.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
On page 60, 1 is the additional first house actions. The first one there is for a state certified sod standard enforcement report.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
Bottom of page 61 is for a used tire cleanup and recycling fund annual report. So this would replace that language with narrative.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
Bottom of page, for middle of page 62, the third edition is for an environmental triggers development and go live date report for the environmental accidents text alert system.
Move to concur.
Thank you.
And in terms of additional pages, page 21 is for an advanced clean cars 2 program manufacturers credit balance report.
Move to concur on the additional committee narrative.
Thank you.
The last agency on the very back of your white packet is the Maryland Environmental Service. The DLS recommendation was annual narrative asking for information about their funding statement and balances. The agency concurred and the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
And there is an additional item for your review on the very back of the pink packet.
Did you second that?
Yeah, Malcolm did.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Go ahead.
There's an additional item for your consideration for MES on the very back, page 22 of your pink packet. This would adopt narrative, essentially giving us a report on compensation for executive level personnel, which is done in other agencies, but we don't have the information from MES since they're non-budgeted.
Move to concur on the additional committee narrative.
Thank you.
And that concludes our report. Thank you.
Great. So we have heard from legislative analysts, and we have either concurred or rejected along with the Senate, and we have additionally added language from our own work. And this is our final official subcommittee meeting, so I'd like to give, starting with Delegate Metzger, an opportunity to say anything you'd like to say about our work this year.
Fourth year I've been on this committee, and I have to say, Team Watson, you led us with professionalism. I was challenged by the homework that you gave us, and it meant a lot because it made me do research deeper. Thank you, publicly.
Thank you for using your time wisely. Delegate Ruff, anything to add?
I would second those comments. And
Thank you.
I definitely have enjoyed working together to push us forward, to make sure that we are thinking critically about the infrastructure of our state and how we are taking care of our future, especially for our children in our environmental spaces, and making sure that we have the means to afford all citizens of our state the ability to get where they're going and to make the money that they need to survive and to thrive. So I just thank you all for your diligence and for pushing us, Madam Chair.
And thank you for working so hard on this committee in your first year. And Delegate Mangione.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's my first year on the committee, and I appreciate your hard work, and to the Vice Chair and Ken as well. And yes, there was some homework that was involved, and helped me learn a little bit more about the committee and how some of these agencies function. And I really do. Although there was 2 people here for one of the committees, you guys kept firing questions. That's how much it really was. It meant that you got some serious answers. And I mean, there may have been 1 million people watching throughout the state, who knows? But I appreciate your dedication and the seriousness and your loyalty to this cause here on this subcommittee. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your work and your engagement this year. And Delegate Solomon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just echo the sentiments of my colleagues. This is my first year on T&E, my 6th year on the committee, and this has been a lot of fun. And a lot of fun because we've been digging into really serious work. And I just want to say I really do appreciate, in particular, obviously all of the issues we've covered, but I think given the seriousness of the gap that we face in our Transportation Trust Fund, the way in which this committee, in partnership with the rest of the full committee and our partners on the Environment Transportation Committee, have really dug in to not, to borrow a phrase from my favorite colleague from Baltimore County, kick the can down the road and really address the problem this year to make it so that our constituents can get where they need to go.
Well said. And we are going to actually adopt the full report in just a second, which is our final action that we need to do. But I do want to say a thank you to Ken, who's done a great job for all of us. Woo! And to Carrie and to Steve and to all of the DLS staff that have supported us throughout this. We have asked a lot of questions, and we know a lot more than when we started this process. My first year as a committee chair for appropriations, you guys have been fantastic to work with and really appreciate. I feel like our process had a lot of integrity this year, and we did a good job. And we can tell by some of the things that came over from the other side, right, where they were asking questions which we already knew the answers to. So you all did a very good job, and I just want to thank the staff and the committee staff for your work. And before we make that final motion, I will say, just in case you hadn't noticed, that the BRFA, anything in the BRFA, will be dealt with tomorrow in the full committee. So we didn't deal with anything transportation related that's in the BRFA because we will do that tomorrow. And at the very last motion will be made by the Vice Chair.
Colleagues, I move the entire report.
All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? And for the record, that was a unanimous vote. And we are adjourned, but I'd like the committee members to come up for a quick picture. Thank you, everyone. I know. We got you out of here. Don't worry.